In early 2025, I uploaded a review video for Fortnite Ballistic, the FPS mode in Fortnite Battle Royale, which is supposed to be Fortnite's take on tactical shooters like Counter-Strike or Valorant. If you only want to know what I think about Ballistic in general, then I recommend watching that video. Since then, Ballistic has got a lot of different updates, and today we're going to talk about the status of the mode, which improvements they made and where it is still lacking. The previously often broken unranked version of Fortnite Ballistic had been replaced by Fortnite Ballistic Test Ground, which was a new unranked playlist to play all the additional new shell maps. The ranked version, on the other hand, only featured complete maps, which meant it still only featured a single map. This split might have been a good idea on paper, but it unfortunately failed in practice. While the original unranked playlist failed due to massive technical issues, which prevented most players from even queuing on it, Ballistic Test Ground on the other hand failed from the lack of players. While it initially garnered some interest, Ballistic Test Ground lost 97% of players within the first 3 weeks. There were often only 200 to 300 players in Test Grounds, and this version of Ballistic suffered from even worse disconnect issues than the ranked version. It was a real plague, and unfortunately not even due to technical issues. A lot of Fortnite players just don't understand the concept of a tactical shooter and disconnect at the slightest inconvenience. I had multiple matches finishing as a 1v2 or 1v3. Test Grounds also had much longer queue times due to a very low player count. In combination, it made Test Grounds practically unplayable. It's honestly a bit sad that they had to remove the unranked playlist in late February 2025 due to technical issues, and Test Grounds in early June 2025, only 2 months after its launch, due to the lack of players and player behavior. The focus after this point completely shifted to the ranked mode, which also inherited the additional maps from the Test Grounds playlist. Allegedly, Epic Games wants to bring back the unranked playlist at some point in the future, but it's certainly bad luck that it already failed twice. But let's now talk a little bit more about the additional maps. As I already mentioned, Ballistic originally only launched with a single map in December 2024. Skyline 10 was admittedly a good map. Not amazing, but a fun map nonetheless. Just having a single map to play for 5 months, however, was completely unacceptable. During 2025, 4 additional maps have been released. Unfortunately, they all released as shell maps, which is a truly bizarre concept. Those are unfinished maps, which instead of actual textures consist completely of these incredibly hideous grey squares. It just looks awful and destroys any kind of atmosphere those maps could have had. The maps also often had to be redesigned based on community feedback, since they usually had some fundamental design flaws in certain places. On the one hand, it's nice that developers apparently also listen to their players. On the other hand, a pretty pathetic display that professional developers seemingly require player feedback to competently design maps. Epic Games obviously tried to frame this under the testing and early access labels, but those honestly just sounded like poor excuses to me. It's obvious to me that Ballistic only got a tiny budget, and probably just a skeleton crew of developers, which could explain why they probably don't have any kind of professional Q&A. But the shell map design cannot be excused. They could literally take any kind of random graphics elements and later exchange them in the finished design, no matter how little effort is being put into a Fortnite creative map, but they all have normal looking maps. There's absolutely no need to have these ugly grey square elements. Early access is just a lazy and poor excuse. The first 2 maps that got added were Hammerfall and Stormchaser Cove in April. Hammerfall is based in a giant castle, while Stormchaser is located in a facility right next to a beach. In May they added the town map Cinewatch, and in June the Korean city map Kaesong Commons. I'm currently working on a map ranking video where I'll be talking in more detail about the designs of the different maps and how I would grade them. Today I'm just going to summarize my thoughts on them. Hammerfall and Cinewatch are actually good additions to Ballistic. Hammerfall is the only map besides Skyline 10 with an actual finished design and real visuals. It's one of the larger maps and probably the best one for long-range engagements. Despite the bigger size, the map has a clear structure and reminds me of classic freeland maps. The unique castle features, like open or closable castle gates and the throne room, are the real highlights. Cinewatch has a pretty different, more winding design. Thankfully the map is neither too large nor too small and got a really nice flow. Even the bomb sites are designed quite well. Not too huge, not too small, with just the right amount of cover. It is also the only shell map where thankfully the ugly grey textures don't dominate everything. The other 2 maps are more problematic. Stormchaser Cove is probably a bit too small. You will rarely get to detonate or even drop a bomb on this map, since the 2 teams often just rush into each other. The rotation time is probably too fast. Before the map redesign, however, had Stormchaser also a more confusing and convoluted design, like some kind of labyrinth. It improved, but I'm still not a fan. Kaesong Commons suffers from the opposite problem. The map is probably too big for its own good. Rotations take too long and new players can easily get lost here. I also think the B point is a bit too difficult to defend in comparison to the A point. Ballistic additionally introduced 6 new weapons to the game during 2025. The drum gun, burst AR, sovereign sniper, machine pistol and veiled precision SMG were permanent additions to the game, while the DL-44 only temporarily replaced the ranger pistol during the Star Wars season of Chapter 6. There were also 4 new flex gadgets added to Ballistic with the fire grenade, the nitro-based overdrive item, the Mad Mist healing grenade and the wall item. Each player gets to choose one of the 9 flex gadgets before the beginning of the match. I'm overall quite happy with the weapon and item additions to Ballistic. While the game mode released with a total lack of maps, the weapon/item pool was at least decent already. These however noticeably improved the variety, and I particularly like the fire and Mad Mist grenades as well as the precision SMG and the drum gun. I would subjectively prefer if Ballistic had more weapons from the earlier, in my opinion much better chapters, but I can understand why using Chapter 5 weapons in Ballistic was at least a lot less work to implement for them, and most players would probably not mind this. As I said, overall those were clearly a step in the right direction. Another really great addition I had asked for was the implementation of a separate sensitivity setting for the first-person perspective. This was desperately needed, since having one sensitivity for third and first-person perspective was not a good solution at all and led to compromised setups. This thankfully got fixed. This also helps with the balancing of the game. Aim assist in first-person mode is lower than in third-person mode, and with forced crossplay in Fortnite and lack of proper FPS sensitivity options, it was a noticeable disadvantage for console players. I don't think there will ever be a perfect solution with forced crossplay, but this at least gives people options to fine-tune their aiming. The disconnect problem I already mentioned in regards to the test grounds playlist is unfortunately still present even in ranked. It is admittedly thankfully less common in ranked than it was in unranked. I practically never have to finish matches in 1v2s or the like in ranked, but 1 to 2 disconnects per team can still regularly appear. Finishing a match with 5v5 is still not the most common case. This might change if you get into the highest ranks, but more casual players still have to suffer from their impatient teammates. I also have to admit that fixing the disconnect problem is much harder to implement since it is mostly based on player behavior. The implementation of a surrender option after a couple of lost rounds was certainly a good step in that direction, but it is more of a band-aid, an open wound than a permanent fix. A big part of the Ballistic player base are just very casual players who browse between game modes and try everything out. They don't see a difference between disconnecting in a ranked Ballistic or quitting a team rumble or solo BR match. If they get a disconnect penalty, but were switching game modes anyway, then the penalty doesn't affect them in the slightest. I would therefore recommend extending the leaver penalty to all game modes of Fortnite. This would probably help to discourage players from leaving mid-match. I unfortunately don't think Epic is brave enough to implement this. Ballistic is based on the player count, probably not important enough to implement a game-wide penalty, and they still want the leavers to buy skins in the shop. I unfortunately think this has a higher priority to them than to keep the game clean. Talking about player numbers, I already mentioned the very underwhelming unranked and test ground numbers before the shutdown of that playlist. Ranked Ballistic started off with around 170,000 player peak in December 2024, which they obviously couldn't hold. In early February it dropped to around 20,000 and during April to around 10,000. Since September the daily player peak is varying between 5 and 7,000 players. Ballistic hasn't reached rocket racing like numbers yet, but the trajectory so far seems clear. We can also see this if we look at the update schedule. Except for some minor stat changes, Ballistic received no updates between December 2024 and April 2025. They just released it and wished people good luck, while also losing all kind of momentum the game mode had. In the next 4 months there were actually a couple of content updates bringing the new maps and weapons, but since August there have been 0 new updates in the last 3 months. There are rumors of a new update arriving with the start of Chapter 7, but those are only rumors so far. I think these long gaps of updates support my hypothesis that Ballistic only has a very small budget and very few developers. Unless Epic drastically changes this, I wouldn't expect to see much different in 2026. Before I forget to mention it, but there are still plenty of bugs and glitches still present in Ballistic. Sometimes it's only minor things like incorrect weapon holding animations, but other times you won't be able to walk or shoot anymore. The first time this happened to me I switched my controller 2 times but nothing worked, till it magically fixed itself in round 5. I think game-breaking glitches like these are another direct consequence of the very small dev team assigned to Ballistic. Nearly a year has passed since the launch of Fortnite Ballistic. I originally criticized the game mode for not having strong enough gunplay, the broken matchmaking, the lack of maps and sensitivity settings. In some of these areas, Ballistic clearly improved. The first person sensitivity setting is greatly appreciated, and the number of maps has significantly increased. A single map was disgraceful. 5 is at least better, but it's also unacceptable that at the point of writing 3 are still shell maps. The experience in the unranked playlist got so bad it had to be removed altogether. At least the ranked playlist works mostly fine from a technical perspective. But there's still more than enough bugs and a disconnect problem present. Especially the latter one negatively impacts the experience of most Ballistic players. The weapon and item additions are a clear improvement, however. Despite these somewhat mixed results, I'm still ready to increase my score for Ballistic from a 5.5 out of 10 last year to a 6 out of 10 today. I do think Ballistic would have the potential to one day become a 7 out of 10 or even an 8. But they would need to introduce even more maps in the future, with none of them being shell maps, and radically redesign the first-person gunplay. Fortnite is great at being a third-person shooter, but the first-person gunplay still lags behind. This is not surprising. The third-person mode in Call of Duty or Apex Legends, for example, are also far worse than the FPS gameplay. The FPS gameplay in Fortnite is probably stronger than that, but it would require a lot of effort, time and money from Epic Games to get Ballistic competitive with dedicated FPS tactical shooters like Counter-Strike, Siege or Valorant. I sadly don't think Epic is ready to do this, and we will only see minor improvements in 2026. But obviously, only time will tell. So overall, Fortnite Ballistic now gets a 6 out of 10. In this sense, thanks for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next one.
The game is good, but it can be better. Why shouldn't it be? All you need is to want it.